and a life that is exclusively my own, even though my own life is not every other life and cannot be. So how is it that the way we comport ourselves, the way in which we specify our modes of existence, what we might call the domain of performativity, is situated in a sphere of relationality without which there can be no persistence? I realize I sound like a Spinozist here. Maybe I am, confession. We do not make ourselves single-handedly, and neither are we fully determined, but we struggle to exist and persist within schemes of recognizability that do not always do justice to the sphere of interdependency in which we live. Let me offer an example that directly relates this issue of performativity to that of precarity. Some of you may know that illegal immigrants in May of 2006 took to the streets in Los Angeles and started to sing the national anthem of the United States. Of course, I don't know why anyone would ever want to sing the national anthem of the United States, but let's keep that to the side for a moment, although I will return. In fact, they sang the national anthem of the United States in English and in Spanish, and a Spanish version was widely circulated on the internet. They also sang the national anthem of Mexico, and sometimes they would sing one anthem right after the other. What kind of public performance was this street singing? Their aim was to petition the government to allow them to become citizens. But what was the way in which they made their petition? Indeed, what kind of performative exercise was this singing? They were exercising the right of free assembly without having the right. That right belongs to citizens. So they were asserting a right they did not have in order to make the case publicly that they should have that very right. But obviously, they did not need to have the right in order to make a case that they should have that right. Luckily, they were not arrested, but they could have been. For the most part, illegal immigrants stay away from any situation in which they might be caught, imprisoned, and deported. But in this instance, they made themselves very public, exercising a right that belongs to citizens precisely because they do not have that right. Now, as you may know, there are political battles in the state of California and elsewhere in the United States about whether English should be the obligatory language for all public services and in all public schools. Those who defend the English-only policies are fearful about how much Spanish is already spoken, but also a dozen other languages in California alone. If the language of the public sphere is supposed to be English, according to the English-only advocates, then singing the national anthem in Spanish is something of an outrage. At one level, singing in Spanish simply asserts that Spanish-speaking people are part of the United States, already its citizens, already its workers, indeed necessary labor, and not only in the fields, but also in the urban centers. But to sing the anthem in Spanish is also to call attention to the cultural presence of the Spanish language. Indeed, the state of California would be unthinkable without the public presence of the Spanish language. This is not a prediction, but something that is already true. So to sing in Spanish is to assert the multilingual reality of the public sphere and to refuse those privatization strategies that require English in the public and relegate other languages to the home, regarded, of course, as a pre-political sphere, which it has never been. Singing the song is also an active way of trying to expose publicly the disavowal of both the Spanish language and of illegal workers in a public sphere that is already pervaded by Spanish speakers and illegal workers. In this way, the song vocalizes the phantom in the public sphere, the sudden visibility and audibility of those who are supposed to remain invisible and inaudible, are supposed to work hours that are illegal according to established labor law, who fear becoming ill since they will not be able to pay for health care, and who are paralyzed with fear when they see police or when their workplaces are raided by Homeland Security, and who themselves have no legal protection against exploitation. So the singing doubtless performs several functions, but let me just underscore the two that I have mentioned above. First, the singing is a way of articulating a right to free expression, to freedom of assembly, and to the broader rights of citizenship by those who do not have those rights but exercise them anyway. And this raises the question of how it is that a right can be exercised when it is not already conferred. My second point, the singing in Spanish on the street gives voice and visibility to those populations who are regularly disavowed as part of the nation, and in this way the singing exposes those modes of disavowal through which the nation constitutes itself. In other words, the singing exposes and opposes those modes of exclusion through which the nation imagines and enforces its own unity. In my recent work, including the small book I wrote with Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Who Sings the Nation State, I turned to the work of Hannah Arendt in order to consider her description of how the nation state is structurally linked with the production of stateless persons, and how those who are stateless nevertheless can and do exercise rights even when, precisely when, those rights are nowhere guaranteed or protected by existing positive law. Perhaps the singing on the street can be understood as one instance through which a right is exercised even when no right exists, or precisely when no right exists. For Arendt, the exercise of this right can never be something that an individual performs. It has to be an action with others, and it has to be public. Indeed, in her terms, it has to enter into the sphere of appearance. For Arendt, the efficacy and the true exercise of our freedom does not follow from our individual personhood, but from social conditions such as place and social belonging. And it's not that we first need a place and a mode of belonging, but that the rights we exercise are grounded in pre-legal rights to belonging and to place. In other words, we have a right to belong and a right to place that are not themselves grounded in the modes of belonging to which we belong or the places where we may or may not live. She refers to the right to have rights, or the right of every individual to belong to humanity, and that these should be guaranteed by humanity itself. Now, what's interesting to me is that Arendt is asserting this right without being able to justify it through recourse to prior grounds. Her assertion of the right to have rights is itself a kind of performative exercise. She's establishing through her writing the right to have rights. There's no ground for this claim outside of the claim itself. And in the same way, those who lay claim to their rights through singing the anthem in public and in Spanish are articulating a right in the moment of enunciation itself. It's not through recourse to existing law, but rather through a certain exercise of freedom. Indeed, the performativity of the assertion in Arendt and in the singing in the street is understood as an exercise of freedom. There's no freedom that is not its exercise. Freedom is not a potential that waits for its exercise. It comes into being through its exercise. So the right to free speech, the right to public freedoms, does not exist in an ideal sphere, but it is precisely that which comes into being when the song starts to be sung, or when Arendt writes the sentences that name and exemplify the freedom at issue. One can see how this kind of Arendtian politics is at once performative and universalizing. She writes, and I quote her, "Our political life rests on the assumption that we can produce equality through organization, because man can act in and change and build a common world together with his equals and only with his equals. Equality is here presumed as a precondition of making and changing the world. But equality only exists to the extent that people do, in fact, make and change the world on equal terms. Although some might say that this is a performative contradiction, it is rather a logic of the performative without which there can be no politics. To be a participant in politics, to become part of concerted and collective action, one need not only make the claim for equality, but one needs to act and petition within the terms of equality, even within the voice, we might say, of plurality. The I is thus at once a we without being fused into an impossible unity. To be a political actor is a function, a feature of acting on terms of equality with other humans. Equality is a condition and character of political action itself at the same time that it is one of its goals. Of course, the criticism of the nation-state has been circulated for some time, even as the continuing power of the nation-state is everywhere acknowledged. Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak herself has made a series of arguments showing how the borders of the nation-state were established in the service of colonialism, and that who counts as a citizen of the nation-state is in no way answered by pointing to the populations that happen to live within its borders. If we look at the carving up of nation-states in the last century, they are very often the consequences of colonial struggles and ways of continuing colonial power, even in the midst of decolonization. Whereas Arendt argued that the nation-state invariably produces stateless peoples, Spivak argues that the nation-state is brought into being on the backs of stateless peoples, and that this is the legacy of colonialism in the making and sustaining of the nation-state. Arendt restricts her study on totalitarianism to European nation-states, and this kind of analysis cannot work to describe the function of the nation-state within contemporary global conditions. Spivak has written, for instance, that on the one hand, the nation-state belongs to Europe, but on the other hand, it's not possible to claim in happy or utopian terms the globe as one's place of belonging. We cannot pretend to have transcended the nation-state, and here I quote from her directly. Only a part of us lives as a subject in the globalized world, but how are we calling it a home? Where do we pay our taxes? How is it that anybody's home today is our globalized world? Because things move fast? Because there are specific groups of migrants who have crowded old Europe? As walls have gone up between the US and Mexico, between Israel and Palestine, and neither India nor China will let the Tibetans cross a border? We are wishfully thinking of a world without borders because European states can cross into each other. This is colonial behavior, she writes. In other words, those who emphasize exclusively porous boundaries, transnational circuitry, the end of the nation-state, are not realizing that migrancy and deportation are forcibly regulated throughout the globe, and that such ideas of hypermobility are based on patterns of movement within the European Union or between first world countries. Spivak asks, what happens to our thinking about the nation-state when we consider state formation in Africa? And here again, is a quotation from her. When the colonialists left Africa,